today. I'm a cultural historian. I deal in my research with Israeli music, and I'm a postdoctoral associate at Duke University where I teach undergraduate courses on modern Israeli culture and society. And I want to relate very briefly to Kelly Cohen's comment about building a positive relationship with Israel and what that means to me in certain regards. And I found in my time teaching undergraduates at Emory University and at Duke and in doing a lot of public scholarship that positive relationships with Israel are like positive interpersonal relationships we have with many people in our lives, where a positive relationship is a healthy relationship, and a healthy relationship requires a certain level of honesty and openness and understanding of the complexities of the entity that you have a relationship with, whether it be a person or whether it be between a young Jewish student and the state of Israel. And I have found in my teaching and in my research that music is a really powerful tool in helping students, the general public, young students, old students, learn about the complexities of culture, and from there start to develop deeper understandings of a society and its different demographic components, its different ethnic components, its different places on the political spectrum. And I want to start us with photographs of some American pop stars. And I'd love to get a basic sense of what this means to you. And what do you see in these artists that you think your students may relate to? And feel free to just pop stuff into the chat. Youth, definitely. Yeah, I think pop culture is something that students definitely connect to. And it's probably the case that for some of these artists, elementary school students may not know about them, but very likely they probably have older siblings, relatives that are playing pop music. But more broadly, what do you think these different individuals represent about American society? Diversity of styles, definitely, Steve. Nice to see you, Steve. And with diversity of styles and diversity of culture and diversity of music culture, we're talking about diversity of society, right? We're talking about different issues, different demographics, different ethnic groups, different political perspectives, different understandings of race and identity. And it's all happening in a public forum that young people are often paying attention to, probably more so than to us as educators. And so integrating these things into a classroom can be a way to tap into a thread of information and even just focusing on celebrities, which students find interesting, as a pathway to teaching something more significant. Now, much like American society is diverse, has different ethnic groups, it has different racial groups, it has different sectors within the political spectrum, Israel is quite a diverse country as well. And similar to the United States and how we see pop music representing so many different aspects of America and issues here and the way that we really understand American society, so too can we pick apart aspects of Israeli society. And so in looking at these photos, what does this tell us about Israel? Is Israel diverse? And please feel free to just enter stuff into the chat. So I think that's an obvious yes, that Israel is an incredibly diverse country. And yep, it's not 100% Jewish. 21% of Israel's population are Arab citizens of Israel, many of whom identify, in fact, with being connected to the Palestinian national cause. yeah, there's different cultures, there's different ethnicities, there's different racial groups, there's different religious groups, and within the Jewish population, yep, exactly, about 26% of Israel's population that are not Jewish. And amongst Israel's Jews, it's likewise incredibly diverse, right? It's not that similar to America, where the majority of Jews here came from either Western Europe in the mid-19th century or Eastern Europe in the late 1800s into the early to mid-1900s. Israel has a Jewish population that is half of Middle Eastern descent. Of Israel's Mizrahi Sephardic population, which represents about half of Israel's population, these are Jews that came to Israel in the 50s and 60s and 70s with Middle Eastern backgrounds. They spoke Arabic, they listened to Middle Eastern style pop music, they ate Middle Eastern foods, and brought an entirely new element of Israeliness to Israel in the early years of the state, but also brought Israel into the Middle East in a certain regard, where we don't necessarily think now about different components of Israeliness and Israeli culture. When we go to Israel, it's just kind of Israel. But when we peel back some of the layers and looking at how even foods we know to be commonly Israeli, like shawarma and falafel and sabich, the Iraqi eggplant sandwich, or kube soup, or couscous, it's important to remember that there was a period of decades where these foods, the musical styles, Mizrahi pop music that we hear so often on the radio in Israel, were not necessarily dominant pop culture, and it took time. Now, we're in a place now in Israel's diplomatic history and in its political dealings where this issue of Middle Easternness in Israeli society, which if we look at it more broadly, if we're talking about roughly 25% of Israel's citizens not being Jews, and of that roughly 25%, about 20% being Arab, Palestinian, Israeli citizens, and half of Israel's Jewish population being of Middle Eastern descent, well, we see that more than half of Israelis, whether Jewish or not, have a Middle Eastern cultural background. And as we are seeing this rapid succession of peace deals between Israel and other states in the Middle East, we are starting to see this Middle Easternness within Israeli culture and society become an important feature of politics. And yes, or that is totally correct that many Israeli Arabs do not indeed consider themselves to be Palestinian. I actually did all of my master's research about Bedouin, and most of the Bedouin in Israel actually emphatically do not identify with the Palestinian national narrative. I was just pointing out that some do. Now, in Israel today, where we do see, like we see on the left from this New York Times headline, that Morocco is joining the list of Arab states that Israel is signing peace deals with. Well, the second largest ethnic group in Israel are Moroccan Jews. And so with a peace deal with a country that is representative of Israel's second largest ethnic group, there's probably going to be some cultural overlap. And one feature of this current round of peace deals that we see is this focus on what we call a warm peace. Now, Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt in 1979, and then a peace agreement with Jordan in 1994. Largely, those are considered in the world of diplomacy to be quote unquote cold peaces, meaning there's diplomatic ties and the governments interact well with each other, but there aren't a whole lot of cultural ties or a whole lot of interactions between the populations. However, this current round of peace deals with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and warming relations with Saudi Arabia, Sudan, grumblings of other countries, we see there being a focus on using these cultural connections to build a sense of commonality and move away from focusing on difference and tension and refocusing on commonality and cooperation. And Mizrahi and Sephardic Israelis are unique to this. Now, a brief bit about the integration of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews into Israel, why music may be a great tool to teach younger students about just that piece of Israel and building this positive, healthy relationship of the many complexities of Israel, but likewise understanding what might be happening today in terms of politics. We can see Sephardic and Mizrahi citizens coming to Israel in the 1950s and 60s, coming into transit camps where conditions were often harsh, and there being a period of tension in the 60s and 70s where even there was a Moroccan Black Panther Party in Israel, modeled after the American Black Panther movement. And then in the 1970s, Menachem Begin, Israel's first Likud prime minister, reaches out to Mizrahi and Sephardic citizens, makes that element of Israeli society and culture part of a new political movement that was forming. And through that process that started with social movements in the 60s and 70s and turned into a political process, evolved into the 80s and 90s and 2000s to a place where Mizrahi and Sephardic culture and identity is represented throughout Israeli life, its cuisine, its music, with Mizrahi pop culture, with politics, with Jewish life and traditions, like we see on the top right, the Mimuna celebration, the North African Jewish celebration the day after Pesach ends, where people listen to great Moroccan music and eat lots of carbs together and celebrate the holiday coming to a conclusion. And music is something that has threaded throughout this entire progression of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews transitioning from living in Muslim lands to becoming Israeli citizens and helping Israeli society evolve. Yes, I would love to go to a Mimuna. It's actually one thing I miss most about being able to go to Israel is spending Pesach there and celebrating with my North African friends. Now, I have provided to you all a list of musical resources. Some of them are just basic. I included a link to Galei Tzahal, which is the Israeli army radio station, which is also one of the most popular radio stations in Israel and streams 24 hours a day with top 40 from America, a variety of Israeli hits, and gives a window into the average life of every Israeli, kind of hearing what they're hearing. Included a link to specifically Mizrahi radio, a variety of historic Zionist and Israeli songs that connect to holidays and elements of Israeli history. And, oh, excuse me, that is correct. Golgolots. And I've also included links to a video from Neda, a very famous Israeli singer that won the Eurovision Song Contest, and a live radio video broadcast of her fielding a call from an Iranian fan, and a variety of other sources. But I want to choose one that I'd like to highlight in this session as a starting point for a conversation about integrating different types of Israeli music into the classroom to both have fun, create opportunities for kids to maybe take a break, sing along to a song and dance, or maybe dive into some serious content. And yes, these resources will all be shared. And as soon as we're done with this video, I will provide a link in the chat to a Google Doc that not only has all the resources, but has a list that I have started of potential lesson ideas is. And I want to open up the conversation so we can all talk about how we can include this video we're about to watch and a variety of other Israeli musical sources into our teaching practices and work with younger students to build this healthy, open, and honest relationship with Israel. So this particular video was released a couple months ago. It is between two artists, one stationed in Tel Aviv, a Mizrahi Israeli pop star, and an Emirati artist that lives in Dubai and wanted to do a music video with an Israeli artist to have a showing to the world of the intention of these two individuals, an Emirati and an Israeli, to do what they can to use their connection, meaning an Arabic pop star and a Mizrahi Israeli pop star who sings in an Arabic music style, to do a music video highlighting Arabic, Hebrew, and English, meaning Arabic and Hebrew, both Semitic languages, different, but they sound similar, and we see word use of words that are even similar in sound, and then English, because that is actually the common language between most Emiratis and Israelis. So without further ado,
يا سلام يا بابا، يا سلام يا ماما، يا سلام يا سلام كل ولاد العالم.
يا سلام يا أبا، يا سلام يا إيمة، يا سلام يا سلام كل يلدينا. You hear me friend far away, far away. You hear my prayer.
I hear you pray far away, far away. I hear you pray. أهلا بك، سلام ومرحبا.
أهلا بك، תודה ברוכבה. أهلا بك, מתי כבר אתה בא?
أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا وسهلا.
دحية
يا سلام صديقي، يا سلام يا صاحبي.
يا سلام يا سلام ما شلونك يا بن آدم.
يا سلام جماعة، يا شباب يا الله. يا سلام يا الكلام.
يا وليد خاف له. You hear me friend far away, far away. You hear my prayer.
I hear you pray far away, far away. I hear you pray. أهلا بك، سلام ومرحبا.
أهلا بك, תודה ברוכבה. أهلا بك, מתי כבר אתה בא?
أهلا وسهلا. أهلا بك، سلام ومرحبا.
أهلا بك, תודה ברוכבה.
أهلا بك،
מתי כבר אתה בא?
أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا وسهلا.
دحية
all right, so I'm going to stop that here. I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint. Let me really quickly shoot the link out to our Google Doc to everyone. All right, so now you all have the Google Doc. This Google Doc contains all of the resources that I had showed earlier in the slide for all the different outlets for music. And before I address Steve and Dr. Teresa's comments, just want to say, and why I say this, incorporating music into almost any class can be a great way to teach content and even create a fun moment of educational value, and it doesn't take special training or expensive resources. There is so much Israeli music available for free on the internet, and it is a wonderful tool to have kids dance and sing a song that's fun, particularly one like this that is so positive and shows such an understanding of building cultural ties and connectivity. And it can also be something that forms a lesson where we talk about even some big concepts about the world, about what it takes to foster positive relationships with others. Now, Steve, this is a great question, and I'll try and address it briefly because I could speak about this for so long, but this fits into this greater conversation about understanding how Israel, in a sense, is part of the Middle East, and that musical culture of Arabic pop stars where men sing and dance together is part of the musical culture of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews that came from Muslim lands and have musical cultures and Jewish cultures and liturgical cultures based on their experience living in the Ottoman Empire in North Africa. And while there may be some things we as Americans find problematic about maybe a male dominant music scene or even religious conceptions of when men and women should perform in each other, it's unique that Israel and other Middle Eastern countries share those cultural similarities because they all come from the same place. And so it is also a unique lens into the commonality between these cultures, in a sense. So let me just check back in the chat. Yes, music is, I'm biased. I'm a cultural historian who focuses on music, and I play music, and I think that it can be used to teach anything. But when we're talking about culture, there are few things as easily accessible and rich and overt in descriptions as music, and even pop music that's fun and engaging to students. So in Israel, you have many women singers and performers in any style. Yes, so in Israel, you have women across the board performing, and uniquely, you even have some Israeli Jews who are performing in the Gulf. Ishtar Alabina, who is an Israeli pop star that moved to Europe, is a North African Jew that has become a pop sensation in the Gulf. And it's less common in the Gulf states to have female pop stars, not in the way that you would see in a country like Beirut or in Egypt, but it's the case too that in the Middle East, Morocco and the Levant and the Gulf all have different cultural realities based on region. If the exclusion of women in the video is not. And I think that that probably is a component of it, Steve, that this sense of understanding modesty and what that means in the Emirati context would make it more palatable for that population. Definitely, it's a great point. So I thought, as just a basic lesson idea, that this sort of song could really even just be something basic to show a map of the Middle East to elementary school students, show where Dubai and Tel Aviv are, listen to the video and show some photos of those cities. How are they different? They're both Middle Eastern cities near a body of water. They're both tech hubs. They're both economic hubs. They both have pop scenes that sound Middle Eastern, but there are also lots of differences. And so this can be an avenue into just looking at cities and sounds and what that means to a young student. I also think that focusing on some of these positive things that are evolving in the Middle East right now through music is a great way to help students connect to some of the good things that are happening in Israel, and in a very honest and open way, show them how Israel is culturally been a part of the Middle East for a long time, but now how it's evolving and what that means for them as Jews, as part of this global Jewish community that have Jewish brethren in other parts of the world that are not Ashkenazi dominant communities, that are Middle Eastern, that look different, that have different customs, that eat different foods. Definitely. What are some other ways, and feel free at this point to just unmute yourselves, but how would you use this type of video and some of the other resources that you now know you have access to in your classrooms? And I just ask, please let everyone know what grade you teach.
So I'd like to say something.
Please.
So within our own communities, there are families whose backgrounds are Mizrahi, and they could be a great resource in terms of, in fact, in our community, there is somebody who does do some cooking, et cetera, and that would be very powerful. And also, what I enjoy very much is there is somebody in my community who does daven in the Sephardi way, which is very beautiful. So it just if people kind of search for that in the community, even have a guest concert, if there are other people in other synagogues, just to have maybe some sort of a concert, or just I love your idea of Mamuna. Of course, it wouldn't be on the day of Mamuna because that's still the 8th day here, but but that would be cool, really cool. So there are all kinds of things that can be done to kind of bring the culture into our communities. So just want to say that.
Thank you, Rosalind.
Yeah.
Anyone else? How could you see music being a tool in your classroom, even just for a way to have fun with students that might have some added level of content value or education value?
So one thing that we're doing a little bit, especially if classes are a little bit longer, like one of my Judaics classes is an hour long, is that the kids need a bit of a break. So to bring them a diversity of music that could be, that could be followed by a 5-minute explanation of what the origin of this music was and where it comes from, right? To show a video like this, or to do like a 5-minute dance party as a brain break, right? 20 minutes into class, and say, this is new music that's combining artists from different parts of the Middle East that are just now forming agreements with each other, that it gives you a hook of Israel education, that this isn't a whole lesson on Israel, right? It's just a casual way, in the same way we might do Mezeg Avir Hayom and talk about the weather in Tel Aviv and in Atlanta. We can also talk about, music, that's becoming popular in Israel that comes from, a variety of different cultures within Israel. And I think that's a great casual way of creating that positive view that Kelly was talking about, without it having to be a whole lesson, or without it having to be a whole piece, right? It could be a 5-minute break.
Definitely.
I think that when I studied languages, and as the non-native speaker here, I can say even English, German, Arabic, every time I learned a new language, using children's songs and children TV show theme songs is a great way to actually learn the language faster and get more practice with it.
Definitely. Just hearing the pronunciation of words, even in a passive activity like taking a 5-minute break to dance and sing along, you're helping with Hebrew and hearing the sounds and hearing the chet, or even maybe talking about the ayin in Arabic and why that's not used in Hebrew anymore. In and of itself could be an interesting way to use sound and place to talk to students.
I'm still using an album from the 70s, right? There was a group of artists that collaborated on a kids album, Yonatan Geffen and Yoni Rechter, Kevaz Shishasar. And what's beautiful about it is Yonatan Geffen published the lyrics as a book of poetry for kids also. And so it's very easy to get both the text and the music in front of the kids. I've been using Kevasashi Shasar for 25, 30 years as a teaching tool for modern Hebrew with kids. Like, it's a great vehicle and it's very accessible. And I have to say, I have it on vinyl, on cassette, and on CD.
Yeah.
I have it too. I love it.
Well, all right, we have to end now. I can tell that we could continue this conversation for a long time, but I'm leaving this Google Doc here. So my hope is that you'll return to it, maybe even write in ideas that you can use amongst each other. And I just put,